Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course preview for this week's BMW Championship. Gonna break down Castle Pines Golf Club. Make sure you have all the information that you need to go out there, get your research process started, whether it's out there for DFS or over there on the outright side, and pick some of your top end plays. So we'll start it off with the course details, a look at the greenskeeper sheet, and then a full hole-by-hole breakdown of this track, which will give you a real good taste of what to expect out there. And then towards the end, a look at my custom modeling and the sort of key stats and comp courses that I'm looking at to go out there and identify my top options. So by the end, you'll have all that research that you're looking for to go out there and get that research process started. So without further ado, a lot that we're going to talk about here. Let's go ahead, just hop right on in with some of those course details. Castle Pines Golf Club is down just south of Denver in Colorado and going to have a huge elevation effect this week. And while you're going to hear almost every content creator mention that fact, there's a lot more to this golf course than just being played at elevation. It's got deep rough, it's got real tricky greens, and kind of looks like a Muirfield Village of the West, and it's going to be an extremely difficult test. So we'll start with the elevation. Yes, it is an 8,100 yard golf course, but it's really going to play closer to 7,400 yards, which for a par 72 setup is really not all that long in reality. And a lot of times you're gonna be hitting less than driver at this golf course. And any of the super long holes, like there's a 680 yard par 5, all play significantly down the hill. Like there's 540 yard par 4s, but they really play closer to about 470 yards. So when we go hole by hole over here on Pro Visualizer here in a little bit, you're gonna get a really good taste for how long the holes actually play, which I think it's probably by far the most important hole by hole breakdown that we'll do the entire year. But yeah, elevation's a factor. Guys that have played out west, played up there at like 5,000-6,000 feet, maybe have a slight advantage. So obviously Wyndham Clark has been talked about probably 1,000 times already this week, but guys like Tony Finau that played elevation, some Pac-12 golfers, heck, even the Vegas guys that have their home base out there have to account for like 7-8% elevation change out there with a lot of their shots. So it's a factor. You're going to hear it spewed a million different times, but that is not the entire golf course this week. Like there's so much more to talk about. Just wanted to get that right off the bat. So this golf course has some relatively small greens, and what you probably won't hear a lot of people talk about is that they're some of the hardest that they're going to see the entire year. They look like almost Augusta National greens when it comes to their sloping. They're already running at 13 on the stimp meter, and while course conditions, weather could play a factor this week if it goes out there and rains, if it doesn't rain, it's going to be relatively firm because of that rocky mountain soil. And also you've got these fast slopey greens that are going to be very difficult to putt and get up and down on. So in terms of like your green complexes, they look a lot like Muirfield Village, and you're going to hear me talk about Muirfield just time and time again here. Guys, it looks like they took Muirfield Village, put it out in Denver, and then made it longer to account for the elevation. In fact, if you take this 8,130 yards and account for that 10% difference, it is almost the exact scorecard yardage of Muirfield Village. Similar agronomy, same architect down here with Jack Nicklaus, of course. This was a Nicklaus design back in 1981. So you're going to hear me mention that comp a lot because, in my opinion, it is by far the best comp course that we have. So you got those small tricky greens just like you'll get at Muirfield Village. And then from the agronomy perspective, though it's not a complete one-to-one comparison, it's more of a pure bent grass over there at Muirfield. It's that bent POA that you get for a lot of these Midwestern golf courses, and the rough is almost identical. It's Kentucky bluegrass out there with a little fescue and rye, which if you look at Muirfield Village is the exact same sort of grass. And if there's a lot of hole-by-hole breakdowns out there already, in fact one done by Golf Digest with Jim Nance, where if you're watching the overhead views, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. They've got a lot of streams out there, which coincidentally look like the streams at Muirfield Village. The bunkering and shapes and depth of some of the bunkers is also just very reminiscent of that golf course. So when we go hole by hole, I think you'll be able to track some of these things. But because we haven't seen this event for over 20 years at this point, we also saw it as a Stableford event as opposed to a regular scoring. We don't know anything with certainty, right? Scoring average could be like 2 shots over par, or could be right about even par, as there are quite a few easy holes mixed in. There's going to be a few potentially even drivable par 4s. There's going to be a par 5 where you maybe have a 9-iron in for your second shot. So there are going to be birdies out there. Again, 8,000 yard golf course, I think it's going to play much more reasonably in terms of its length. But there's a lot of really tricky aspects to this golf course as well. So unfortunately, without all that data that we normally go through here, we're not going to have as much to give you from the analytics side. But now let's go hole by hole, show you guys what these players are going to be facing. And this hole by hole breakdown, by far the most important of the year. What is absolutely beautiful about this Pro Visualizer breakdown is it gives us the impact of elevation on these shots. So what you'll see over here on the right is we have the true length of hole number 1, which is a 651 yard par 5. On paper would be almost unreachable even for your longest players, but you can see down here that we've got the elevation change. It's about 45 yards out there from tee to green, but this plays like number, which not only accounts for the drop out there in elevation, but also accounts for the effect of the ball going further in the thin air. So if we take a look at this over here, your first shot I've got out here at 373 yards. Well, in reality, that would be like hitting a 315 yard drive, which for these sort of players in thin air is going to be very simple to go out there and do. And your second shot, which is about 277 yards, realistically is going to play closer to 251, and that would be to the entire center of the green. Right front of the green is probably closer to about 235 yards. So hole number 1 is where you can get a taste of some of the differences in yardages, and even though this looks like an absolute brute of a par 5, it's more reachable than almost all of them out there in the PGA Tour. It plays like a 568 yard hole, and really where I think you're going to see a lot of separation this week, we'll talk about this a ton when we get to the hole by hole, the custom model here in a few minutes, is that if you miss the fairway is when you start to have the issue, right? You miss the fairway, you're not going to get as much rollout in this downhill par 5, which means you're going to have a longer shot in, and then out of the rough, the ball isn't going to stay in the air nearly as long. So the missed fairway penalty this week, and part of this is because of the elevation change, is my opinion going to be a lot higher than what we normally have. You're not going to get that same thin air effect out of that deep rough, and I think you're going to see the guys that miss a lot of fairways really struggle to score around this golf course. Hole number 2 is 435 yards. This is one where you're probably hitting iron off the tee, and you may say, a 325 yard drive, how could you possibly hit an iron there? Well, it's because it plays 288 yards. It also plays about 20 yards down the hill out there for your first shot. And even if you were to hit like a 4-iron, maybe even a 5-iron off the tee, you're still going to have a wedge into this green. So this is an example of one of the more scoreable holes that we have out here. And I don't want to put it past players to try and take it either to the green or a little bit past it to the left here. You'll see that it's playing like 350 to actually carry this water. But if you were to hit it over here to this left corner, so let's say around this marker, it's only a 330 yard drive. I say only 330, but there are plenty of guys on this field that have that in the bag to where you could have just a little flip wedge in. So I think the most prominent play is going to be to take it back a little bit, probably hit an iron off the tee here. But if you were to hit driver, as long as you're not completely wiping it out to the left, you could just have literally like a 30 yard shot in. Hole 3 is 475, so one of the quote-unquote longer par 4s out here. But even here, if you hit less than driver off the tee, maybe even a driving iron off the tee here, first off, large landing area before you get up here to the fairway where it narrows with this lake to the left and then the bunkers to the right. If you hit an iron off the tee here, you have 175 in, which normally would be maybe a 7-iron for players, maybe an 8-iron for some of your longer ones out there. Well, now it's only playing 160 yards, and I guarantee you that there are going to be guys that are hitting a 4-iron off the tee and then a pitching wedge into this green, which is just unheard of for a 475 yard hole. So I think you're going to hear people talk about bombers this week. It's all 8,000 yard golf course. You've got to play the longer players. They're full of shit. That is not true. Driving distance, I think, is helpful like it is at any golf course. But if you think this is a bombers fest, you don't know golf. Hole number 4 is 252 yards. Once again, looks like an absolutely brutal hole, but because it plays slightly downhill and with the elevation change, it only, and I'll put only in quotes, plays 230 yards. Coincidentally, some of the longer par 3s around Muirfield Village, when they're tipped out, play to that same sort of distance. And you can see here what I mean about the Muirfield Village shape is it's mostly rough around the greens. You also have some deep, really tricky bunkers around this golf course. And unless you're short, the collar's right in front of the green complexes, you're not going to be hitting a lot of chips off the short grass. So once again, something that we see at the Memorial every year, and why I'm so huge on that comp course this week. Hole number 5 is 487. This one does play slightly up the hill, so you can see its true yardage is actually only 20 yards different than what you have here with the scorecard yardage. That is the smallest difference that we've seen so far because it is playing back up the hill. So rather than having that elevation change helping you out here, this is actually going to be one of the harder holes out there. You're going to hit at least a 3-wood to this corner. If you choose to take driver, it does narrow up that fairway area significantly. Another thing that we see around Muirfield Village. And then this green complex, it's a tricky shot up the green as well. It's even more so uphill for your second shot, and a really narrow green complex. So this is one where you could have a shot off that short grass, one of the few greens that isn't protected by that deep rough as much. To the right side, of course it is, but front left and to the, well, I guess back left, you also do have that short grass. Hole 6 is 453, so it's another one that plays up the hill. You can see that this hole, right, is only about 10 yards off its actual yardage when it comes to how it's going to play. So these uphill holes are the ones where you can kind of treat them like normal out there, and where your numbers, if you're hitting like a 9-iron about 150 yards, you're maybe hitting an 8-iron at the very least. Sorry, if you're hitting an 8-iron normally, maybe you're hitting a 9-iron, as opposed to like other holes where like if you're normally hitting an 8-iron from the distance, sometimes it's a pitching wedge or gap wedge. Hole 7 is 207. This one's really going to play about 180 yards. You would think that because it's quote-unquote shorter than the first par 3, that it would maybe be a little bit easier, but this might be one of the hardest holes on the golf course. What I've been told about this green, I've, of course, never played this golf course myself. I'd love to at some point in my life, but what I've heard about this green is that's one of the most tricky in the world. You can kind of see it from the overhead views, maybe not on the video on YouTube. The resolution is not going to be as perfect, but there are tons of little hills on this green. In fact, you can kind of see them, as I said, over here from this overhead view, but there are essentially like 5 different greens on that hole there, and I completely lost it there, so let me go to the previous shot so we can see that. But essentially what you're getting with this hole is there's one green to the back left. There's one here to the front middle. There's one over here to the right side. There's one right on that marker there in that middle section, and everything slopes away from it. It's essentially like 4 or 5 different crowns on this green, and it's one of the harder par 3s that you're going to see on the PGA Tour, at least from what I've heard. Hole number 8 is 598, so this one is a par 5, but is easily reachable in 2, even though it does play uphill. So if I go ahead, set the first target a little bit further out for these Tour Pros, and then I set the second one on the green, you guys can see what I'm talking about. It's about 310 off the tee, which is pretty doable. It's playing about 590 yards, which once again is pretty close to the actual scorecard yardage, as these ones are the ones going back up the hill. Hole number 9 is also a tee shot that's downhill, but then a second shot that is back up the hill. This creek to the right looks just like the creek at hole number 18 at Muirfield. I believe it's to the left at that golf course, but just a ton of similarities and parallels that you can make from golf course to golf course. So it's maybe not as many trees out there this week, which is kind of surprising given it's out there in Colorado. A lot of trees out there in Colorado if you haven't been out that way. But yeah, this hole right here, really narrow green complex, tough to hold out there with your second shot, particularly if you're coming out of the rough. Hole 10 is 540 yards, so this is definitely a really tough hole if you end up starting on the back. If they choose to do split tees, you'll see players starting there, but unless there's a weird weather situation going on, that is probably not going to happen. But it is off downhill off the tee, so it's going to play a lot shorter. So though it's 540, you can see it only plays about 476 in reality, which is still a tough par 4, don't get me wrong, but it's far from undoable. 11 is 194, so this one is, again, a shorter par 3, but plays significantly downhill, which makes finding a shot extremely difficult, or finding the right distance something that's hard to do. And this is kind of like what you have with 12 at Augusta. This creek in front of it, at least, it's a much longer shot, right? It's got that downhill aspect that you don't get at Augusta. But apparently the bunkers on this hole are some of the hardest on property, and it's a much harder shot than you'd think, even though it only plays about 165 yards. Hole 12 is 448, so this is another one of the more scoreable holes out here. It only plays about 420 in reality, so probably a 3-wood and wedge for most players. 13 is 484, so this one does play slightly down the hill for the second shot. So it plays about 450 yards in reality, and it's not like there aren't scoreable holes out here. Like there are par 3s that are like 160, 170 in terms of its actual playing distance. You've got par 4s that are playing like 420 yards, and then you'll see with some of the finishing par 5s that there's also scoreable looks there as well. Hole 14 is 652. This one plays a lot shorter than the scorecard yardage. In fact, just like hole number 1, it only plays about 587, which you could put in quotes, right? If you miss the fairway here, you're definitely not going for it in 2. But what you see here is that there's a little bit of risk-reward aspect, just like what you get at Muirfield Village on the par 5s. You've got a retention lake to the left. You turn over a 3-wood, you're probably going to end up in that. And even your layup can be tricky because of this creek. 15 is 439. This one does play slightly downhill. Actual playing distance is only about 400 yards, so definitely a scoreable look, just like you had at 14. 16 is a tough par 3. In fact, this is probably one of the tougher holes on the entire site. It does play only about 210 yards because it's flat out there, but this bunker to the left is extremely penal. The one over the back is maybe even harder because of the slope of the green. A brutal hole if you end up missing the surface. 17 is one where I think you might see a 20 to 30% eagle rate. It's a par 5 and it only plays about 527 yards in reality. So it does play up the hill. So that's why it's pretty close to the actual scorecard yardage, even with elevation change. But you could hit a 3-wood to the corner here. I mean, driver. I mean, look at all this room you have. It's not like it's a tough driving hole at all. Your second shot is where it gets a little bit harder. This green complex slopes insanely. It's insanely sloped, I should say, from back to front. Maybe even like a 5-6% grade out there, which means if you end up hitting it over the back and it's like a back pin location, like back left or like right back or something like that, like near this little scuff on the green, that shot is impossible to get up and down. In fact, you're going to have a hard time hitting chips from over the green and keeping it on the green complex because it is so narrow. So what you're going to see a lot of players do this week, and I think it's not the worst idea whatsoever, is lay up right in front of these bunkers. So you can see this second shot right here. If you don't hit the fairway, you're 100% going to be hitting it to this marker right here. And then that chip shot is one of the easier ones that you're going to get on tour because of how much slope you have coming back into you. Whereas if you hit the if you hit the fairway, I should say, you're going to go for the green, but you're probably going to take one less club. My professional opinion, my professional advice for this hole would be to hit one less club and hit it at that front right portion. If you happen to hit it a little bit further than you think, get it up onto the green complex, great. If not, you're going to have a very simple up and down. So I think that's what you're going to see a lot of. And from what I've heard, it's easier to chip in on this hole for eagle. At least that's what Jim Nantz said on his preview. They go out there and putt from above the hole, but we'll see if that's the case this week. And then finally, hole 18 is a tough finisher. It's a long par 4, but only plays like 485 yards in reality, which would still be a stiff par 4 out there in the PGA Tour. But when you're going to hear people this week talk about, oh, driving distance, oh, it's an 8,000 yard golf course, this is where you give them a rebuttal, right? Because even the long par 4s are like 480, which for tour standards is not atypical, right? We even get that at like the Wyndham Championship, Sedgefield, out there at like a 7,100 yard golf course. So don't overreact to the scorecard yardage would be my recommendation. I think driving distance would be helpful, particularly in some of those, risk reward par 5s, but this golf course is about keeping yourself in play. If you can hit the fairways, I think you're going to get a huge advantage when it comes to the extra distance out there. Whereas if you're short and a little bit offline, I think you've got next to no chance this week. Those long holes that play 540 yards are going to play a lot closer to that yardage if you're not hitting out of that short stuff and you're not getting that high ball flight like you normally do. And now for the course modeling, which for this week, it's definitely going to be a little bit of trial and error. First time that we've seen this track, but definitely some stuff that I think we can narrow down on. So it started off with just a look at what I did for the model. So in terms of your regular old shots gain metrics, I think you should always be including those. I went 20% off the tee, which is actually pretty heavy in that category. We're going to have something to add on top of that here in just a second. Actually, I think I took it out of the modeling. So yeah, just 20% off the tee. I was potentially going to look at driving accuracy, but I went with off the tee as being long and straight is going to be a huge asset this week. If you're long and you're a little bit offline, I don't think it's the end of the world as you can get out of some of that rough. But yeah, having accuracy is going to help, and same thing with distance. If you have both of them, even better. 38% on approach, 5% around the green, 12% out there on the regular putting. We will be adding to that, though, when it comes to the bent POA stuff. In terms of around the green numbers, I'm adding some emphasis on around the green out of rough and bunkers. So some golf courses around the PGA Tour where you get that same kind of setup, you know, PGA Championships, a lot of US Opens, maybe not Pinehurst this year, but other sort of US Open venues where you get that deep rough and those tough bunkers around the green. So I'm adding a little bit of that emphasis. I'm looking at shots gained putting on bent POA. That, of course, is the surface for this week, as we were talking about earlier. And then the last thing I added was shots gained at Muirfield Village. If you couldn't tell, I think that it's a really good golf course for this week. And in fact, out of all the courses on the PGA Tour, it's the only one I'm using as a comp course this week. So I've got that at 13%. I think that there's just a sort of player that you see succeed at those golf courses. You get a lot of your like Scotties, your John Rahms, elite drivers that have played well there before, but also your Billy Horshells that go out there and win. Your more accurate players like a Denny McCarthy that have shown up there, and Adam Hadwin. And what a lot of those players have in common is that they're accurate off the tee and they're really good with those irons. So you can tell on here, right, I'm looking at Muirfield, but our main things are approach play, right? Trying to find the guys who are the best with their irons. And because I don't think we know where a lot of these approach shots are going to come from, I'm not looking at a specific proximity bucket, right? But without having that data, without having an idea where the field is hitting their shots, I'm just not comfortable adding that extra emphasis. So I just put it all on regular shots gained approach lately. Off the tee, as I mentioned, I thought that accuracy might be worth looking at, but I do want to look at that driving distance, as having that distance on an 8,000 yard golf course isn't something that we can completely overlook. So what you can tell on this, right, is I don't have just a driving distance factor on there, right? I don't have a lot of the same kind of stats that we'd normally be looking at, as there's a lot more unknown with this track. So let's just run the model. Let's see what it spits out for us. And what you're going to see is a lot of elite players towards the top. Scotty number 1, Xander number 2, guys like Rory still up there in the mix, but number 3, Aaron Rai. Somebody that checks the box with both the driving accuracy and distance, and has just been solid across the board. So there's a Victor Hovland down there at number 4. He's been decent around Muirfield Village, of course, with the win out there a few years ago. A decent bent POA putter, and the ball striking stats are what are carrying him lately. There's a Tony Finau, decent at Muirfield Village. Also, you know, some decent ball striking stats hitting in. There's a Morikawa. There's more of that accuracy first sort of player. So what I get with my motto here is a good mix of bombers. I mean, yeah, sure, you got the Rorys up there. You've got guys like Scotty, Xander, right? Some of the best drivers in the world, but then some of your more positional sort of players. So I think part of that is by using the Muirfield Village comp. Part of that is just by looking at regular shots gained off the tee, as opposed to looking at driving distance as a factor at this golf course. When you mix in this around the green stuff, you mix in some of the bent POA numbers, is where you start to separate yourself from other players. And I think one guy I really want to point out here is Patrick Cantlay, who's been an absolute killer around Muirfield Village. And coincidentally, he also went back-to-back at the BMW Championship 3 and 2 years ago. So maybe in play this week, might be an outright bet that I end up taking at some point. But yeah, nice to see that he's number 8 in my model, right? He's just behind some of those elite tier players. Tony Finau, definitely a little bit higher than I was expecting. Max Grazerman, an obvious guy that's ranked a lot higher than he probably should be. But with the form lately, I guess you couldn't argue against it. You've got guys like a Shane Lowry, Hideki Sanjay down here. More positional kind of players that I think a lot of people are going to overlook. People are just going to have a hard-on out there, for lack of a better word, for your bombers, right, playing in an 8,000 yard golf course, and I don't think they're doing it the right way, right? This is actually closer to a 7,400 yard golf course, where length would be nice to have, especially out of that rough, but it is not the end-all be-all. You've got an Akshay there, right? He's not a bomber. You do have Ludwig on there. He was long and straight. His form has been a little bit sour lately, but if he can figure out the iron play, go out there and gain on these greens, you can see bent POA has not been his best surface so far this year, then I think he's well within reason to go out there and win this event, because he's one of the elite drivers of the golf ball that can both hit it a long way and be very accurate off the tee. Let's move on a little bit further down here. We've got Russell Henley, Robert McIntyre that are potentially in play. There's the Adam Hadwin play I was talking about before. Corey Connors, a very accurate driver. Nick Dunlop is going to be one of the chalkiest guys out there in the field. And then what I'm going to do is scroll down to the very bottom here, show you some of the, I guess, lower tier options that you guys could look at. Max Homa cannot keep the ball on planet Earth. I will say that at a golf course where if you're short and inaccurate that you have no chance. that I hate to say it, Max, but you pretty much don't have a chance at this golf course. I love you to death, one of my favorite players out there to watch, one of the best people out there in the PGA Tour, but it's not a week to play those sort of guys. A JT Poston as well, right? Not the most accurate or long driver off the tee. Guys like a Steven Yeager, Cam Davis, they're going to have to find a way to not miss as many fairways. A Chris Kirk, if he's not going to be accurate off the tee, then watch out. Woof. He could be in for a really rough week. A lot of these guys towards the bottom end of the modeling are just bad form players, right? Like that's what you're getting down there with Max Homa, but in a lot of cases also have not played well at these sort of golf courses. Somebody I would kind of throw to the side, I don't think I'd be as worried about Billy Horschel here. He's got a really good track record around Muirfield and is accurate off the tee. So part of this with Billy is just the fact that he's in a field that's a lot stronger than what he's used to, right? Him being about a neutral in all 4 stat categories is just not going to be good enough compared to some of these other top tier players. But yeah, maybe a decent Billy Ho week. Even guys like a Siwoo, a Denny, I actually don't think are the worst plays in human history. It's just that they're in a field with all of the world's best players. So that's the model for this week. Those are some of the rankings. To show you some of the best players out of the around the green at these golf courses. Number 1's Hideki, of course, coming in off a win at the Fedex St. Jude, so great form there. There's Scotty, of course. There's Jason Day, Siwoo Kim, maybe a few sleeper plays to consider. There's Alex Norton. There's Cantlay the whole way down there out of the rough and bunkers. You take a look at the bent Poa green, so just putting on this, that's where Denny was popping. You obviously saw him play very well at Muirfield Village as well. Those were pure bent grass greens, though. You've got Wyndham up there, so course horse that you're going to hear, talked about probably 1,000 times this week. I don't think that Wyndham, by the way, is the worst course fit. He's actually playing pretty solid golf lately. So he might be somebody, or I should say was somebody yesterday that I was highly considering for this event. But the fact that everyone is just talking about like, oh, he's played this golf course before, like great. Same thing with Xander around Torrey Pines, and he missed the cut like 3 of his first 4 years there. He had like no top 25s till he went out there and nearly won the damn golf tournament. So let's pump the brakes a little bit on those narratives. So we'll have to see in DFS. If he's going to be like 20% chalk, no thank you. I'm just not going to buy in that narrative and play him. If we're getting a reasonably owned Wyndham Clark, then by all means, I probably will be using him. But I have a sneaking suspicion that it's going to be the prior, that he's going to be way, way higher owned than he probably should be. The other guys on this bent Poa, you've got Xander towards the top. That is always great to see. Robert McIntyre, that's another surface that he's been doing really well on. But there's Adam Hadwin again. Very sneaky play this week, in my opinion. And he's, what, like 6,200 in DFS? Could give us a little bit of upside there. They've got guys like Sanjay showing up again, also been okay around a Muirfield Village. And then finally, if we sort this by the Muirfield Village shots gained, number 1 is Scotty Scheffler, who, by the way, guys, I think there was a golf course that was built for Scotty. It's pretty much what we're getting this week. You got Cantlay in number 2. I already told you guys, I think this is a really good week for Cantlay. Hopefully other people aren't as high on Cantlay as me, so we can get him at lower ownership. But you've got Colin up there. You can't, I mean, look at the shots gained record, just green across the board. Adam Scott has had a really good track record at Muirfield. That one's maybe a little bit more surprising, but you've got your Rorys, your Xanders up there, right? The cream normally rises to the top around the Muirfield Village, and I think you're going to get that same effect this week. So it's going to be one to play the studs. Maybe you'll have a few diamonds in the rough, like a Grazerman, a Hadman that you can get to. Heck, maybe even an Adam Scott, right, that you're taking down here at relatively low ownership. Outside of that, though, it's going to be trying to jam in a lot of these top-end options. Alrighty, guys, that is all I've got for the course breakdown this week. Hopefully you feel a little bit more prepared to get your research started and are as excited as I am out there for this week. It's a great golf course, going to be one of the more beautiful tracks that we see all year, and then it's the top 50 out there in the PGA Tour. So in terms of pound-for-pound strength, you're not going to see that beat the entire year, except for next week out there at the Tour Championship. So I'm still maybe even going to be going to the Tour Championship next week. It's like a 65% chance that I'm going to be going. Did have a really big score over there for MMA, so does help out with some last second traveling arrangements, right? Having that extra spending money there. So we'll have to see. If I do, I'll let you guys know well ahead of time because I'll be on site trying to get the look at the new renovations around East Lake Golf Club. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of that when it drops. Also smash the like button if you guys haven't already. And if you're looking to win a free month of my Patreon page to go out there and get all of my projections research for both DFS and on the prop side, well, make sure to go ahead and give me your winning score for this week. It's going to be a tough one out there with this sort of track. I'm not even going to give you guys my number so that nothing's going to be taken off the board. So go ahead, claim your score down below. Once a score is taken once, it cannot be taken again. So go ahead, give me your best guess for that. And I guess I'll give you one. This is not going to be taken. So if you want to take the score, I guess you can take it yourself. I'd say like 10 under par is probably a good barometer. You've got some easy holes. By easy, I mean like eagle holes out there, like what you have with 17. So I think players are going to take advantage in a few cases, but that long rough, it's just a really tough course to hit fairways at. I think a lot of guys are going to shoot over par. So I'm going to say -10. I think somebody goes out there and does a decent job with the scoring. But yeah, if you want to take -10, feel free to do so as long as you're the first one to do so. And go ahead and give me your best guess as well. That's all I've got, guys. I appreciate the support here on the channel as per usual. Smash that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And I'll be back for the DFS and betting preview a little bit later on this evening.